Hi, welcome to the bathtub. Lucky's back on the sofa. You back on the sofa, doggy dog? Is she over there? There she is. She comes up and does one. She does one appearance, and then 2 minutes later, I do the same thing. She says, "I've done that. I've done that already. I don't need to go see him." And everything's going well. So here's our Clear Mountain water. Those of you who've been following the show, this stupid show since the mid 30s, I think it was the mid 30s, with Jack Benny and people. Those people used to drop through all the time. Know that we've been through a lot of generations. We've been through the high tech, super tech generation. We've been through the USO years, and now we're at the post tech, bathing with a vengeance. We're taking this show right out, taking it right out with the end of the planet. Okay, we're not going anywhere until the planet does. We're going to talk today. Oh, first of all, self promotion, shameless self promotion. Very quickly, reading great books in the bathtubs. My book of essays and many personal essays. The closest to an autobiography I have ever written is all the essays in this, and then lots of reviews, often of books that we've talked about on the bathtub. And I sell them to you for $12. I sign it and send it to you for $12 if you write me, and we rate some. You can go on my Ultimate Beginners Facebook page. You can find me somewhere, or you can buy them on Amazon. Those bastards at Amazon. Don't forget, it's a Better World Books. We're all buying from Better World Books now, right? We don't buy from those bastards if we can help it. And Better World Books. I'm pretty sure that's who I've been using now. The other book is on my new novel. I published this last year. It is about a guy who's irresistible to women. Nothing to do with me, as you all know. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm as resistible as you can get. It's called On the Planet of Bold Women. They're not hirsute women. They're not dandelion women. They're not phony baloney women. They're bold women, and they live their lives with this character, whose name I don't remember at the moment. Daniel Listmeyer, I think his name is. Today we're going to finish up. You know, as you come into this, the bathing out with the planet and all that, I start thinking about things I'm still trying to finish off, close off the shelves. Many years ago, I'm pretty sure it was during the first Trump administration. Did you ever think we'd be saying that? During the first Trump administration, I talked about James Tiptree Jr. and this excellent biography. We've talked about this before, by Julie Phillips. It came out in 2007. It is published by Picador. It received lots of attention when it came out. And those of you who know James Tiptree Jr. know a bit about the history of this woman, this fascinating woman named Alice Sheldon. The subtitle of this book is the Double Life of Alice B. Sheldon. I read the first half of this book several years ago when we talked about James Tiptree Jr.'s first book, 10,000 Light Years from Home, which is still, in some ways, it's my favorite. It's still my favorite of her books. A lot of people don't think so, but I thought those some of her funniest, weirdest stories are in there. And this is about her life. And she was a woman who was, I think, a research scientist, or she is a psychologist. She worked in some government jobs. She was married to a guy about 15 years older than her, and had a very interesting, not an unhappy life, but it seemed like she was a strange, interesting woman. And she created the name James Tiptree Jr. and started selling science fiction stories in the 60s to places like Galaxy and If and places like that. And I read many of those stories when I was in my big science fiction phase in the 60s and early 70s. And she would publish these stories. She developed very quickly among writers, science fiction writers, a great reputation. She was a writer's writer. She brought something to science fiction that was very unusual. She was a real kind of a spiky, smart, intelligent prose writer. Her stories were unusual. You didn't really know what was going to happen. They changed tones very quickly, which is I like about writers. Sometimes it'd be very funny and just ridiculously funny. And other times they would be quite complicated psychologically and mentally and narratively. And other times they're very dark. Many of them are extremely dark. And we'll talk about a couple. Anyway, as James Tiptree Jr., for about 10 or 15 years, she was a notorious letter. She wrote letters to all these writers. And I knew people when I was at an early Clarion up in Seattle, Vonda McIntyre and Joanna Russ, and especially a lot of the women writers were really, they thought it was a man. Most of them thought James Tiptree Jr. was a man. There was lots of arguments about it being a man or a woman. And but they all found her writing very interesting because she did write about gender a lot and sexuality. And they were all writing letters back and forth to her. And James Tiptree wrote these kind of wacky letters. In the book, one of the things I like about Julie Phillips's book is that she refers to James Tiptree as he, because there is a sort of gender there's a gender uncertainty in a lot of Sheldon's life, and when she was playing James Tiptree, she sounded like a man to many people. So he refers to her as this kind of male persona. And James Tiptree Jr. wrote lots of people, won some awards. Harlan Ellison, we've talked about Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions books. When I was a kid, I read those first two books from cover to cover, sometimes a few times, and I really enjoyed a lot of those writers. And he really, as usual, Ellison was pretty sharp. He was pretty quick off the mark to recognize important writers. And he gave James Tiptree Jr.'s amazing story, The Milk of Paradise, which is in this book we're going to talk about, a big, prominent pitch. He put it as the last story, and he said, this is a great writer and all this stuff. And he was right. It was an amazing little story. And he helped get her off the mark. And she did very well. She was a very successful short story writer in one of the few genres where you could publish books of stories. She wrote 2 novels, which I've never heard are particularly great. They're probably worth reading. Anyway, that's a long way of getting to say this is a really fascinating book. It goes into also, she later creates a woman writer named Raccoona Sheldon. So there's 3 characters basically in the book. Again, we're not talking about the severe personality disorders that you see like in Sybil and so forth, but she created these 3 characters and found ways of them to coexist in her life. Fascinating woman. Anyway, I really enjoyed the biography, and in the middle of it, I went back and finished. So 4 years ago, I started her second collection, Warm Worlds and Otherwise. It's got some of her more famous stories in it. I'm going to talk quite quickly about this. I don't remember some of these I read about 4 years ago, but some of these stories are just brilliant. Some are minor. For example, there's one very minor story in here called The Night Blooming Saurian, which is about time travel, where a bunch of time travels go back to a period in the past, and they try to pretend there's dinosaurs there, so they eat lots of food and create lots of poop, and they fill this camp with human poop, which later people think is dinosaur poop. It's kind of a stupid story, but it's light. And there's a story in here called Amberjack, which I never quite understood. And then it has a very funny story, Through Alas Darkly. I think I'll read just a quick passage from this. It's one of her very light comic stories, but it's very funny. And the gimmick is, can I find it here? The Girl Who Was Plugged In. It was one of her award-winning stories. It's about a guy who's sitting in his office, and this girl materializes from what it looks like the future. And I'll just give a really quick passage. Through Alas Darkly. Maltby Trot was used to girls materializing in his rotten little office. As a rule, they were looking for somebody else, especially after they saw Maltby. So when the girl materialized by his dead air conditioner, Maltby just lifted his pinkies from the keyboard and waited. Said the girl. You're looking for candy, I suppose. God, no, I'm looking for the birdie poo, she snapped. Well, it's down the hall. Maltby's gesture hit his knuckles on the wall. It was a rotten office. Oh, I can't go now, Dottie. Maltby sucked his knuckles. Why not? Because obviously I'm in a temp sink, she told him crossly. I've got to wait. Nothing's explained. This girl talks in this futuristic lingo, and we're getting to understand she's caught in some sort of time trick or something like that. Maltby took off his glasses. She seemed to be quite a tender-looking little biscuit with luminiferous hair. You could push a chair over. Anyway, you could sort of see that the way he looks at this girl and the kind of pretty but kind of dingy kind of character, it almost is like a male gaze on this woman. She writes very well from men's points of view throughout the book. Anyway, there's light stories like that. There are stories like The Last Flight of Dr. Ain. If you know Tiptree, then you know this story. I read this when it came out in Galaxy. I was like 14 or 15 years old. and it was a little confusing. It's confusing the first time you read it, less confusing. I must have read it 5 or 6 times by now, including it. I reread it again last night. It's an incredible little story. It's like remember during the pandemic, everyone was watching that Soderbergh movie about, I forget what it was called now. It was called Pandemic or something like that. It was about a disease traveling airborne through the world and killing everybody. It's a 4-page story. I'll read the first paragraph. Dr. Ain was recognized on the Omaha-Chicago flight. A biologist colleague from Pasadena came out of the toilet and saw Ain in the aisle seat. 5 years before, this man had been jealous of Ain's huge grants. Now he nodded coldly and was surprised at the intensity of Ain's response. He almost turned back to speak, but he felt too tired. Like nearly everyone, he was fighting the flu. Every sentence of that opening paragraph is important because basically what Dr. Ain is doing, I don't want to give too much of it away, but I'm going to, is destroying the world with a virus. And there's a woman that keeps coming in and out of the picture. People keep saying, did you see a woman with him? I thought I saw a woman. There's a story about his relationship, who's almost like an earth mother. It's almost like an earth goddess. It's a 8-page story, really powerful, a little confusing. It takes a while to get to the end, but by the end of it, all the people who are sniffling, of course, are all dying at the end of the story. And it is something that comes up a lot in Tiptree, which is just complete horrificness of kind of almost a worldly destruction, at which point it almost releases the worst that's in human beings. Does that make sense? They're not totally negative like Dr. Ain, negative catastrophes, because it's almost like the death of all these human beings means the earth might actually survive a little bit. It's a very complicated, powerful little story. An equally powerful story is called The Women Men Don't See. The first time I read it, I didn't quite get it, but I won't read a passage from that either at the moment because there's just so many interesting parts in it. But it's about a man on a flight down through Mexico, I believe, somewhere in Mexico or Central America, and there's 2 women on it, and a woman and her daughter, and they're kind of peculiar, interesting characters to him. The plane crashes, and in the course of this surviving out in this middle of the wilderness, it turns out that this woman and her daughter are kind of living apart from men. They have a kind of a distrust and a kind of contempt for males, and they try to have children without getting too involved with men. That's the story how I got it. And basically, they're out there because they work for the government. The mother works for the government, and she's trying to make contact with interstellar students. There's the students from another planet who are wandering around this part of the wilderness. That's how I read it anyway. And I don't want to tell you much more than that, except it's quite a powerful story. It has one of the best endings I've ever read, and it's pure SF. So she doesn't do, what would you call it, metaphoric SF. She does real kind of SF, imagined futures, imagined alternate lives, imaginative aliens, which she's very good at. Finally, a story I'd never read or heard before. Though there's a very interesting story called Love is the Plan is Death. Again, there's just so much. I can't really read much more. We're running out of time. It's all told in the voice of an alien, a kind of spider-like creature. And it's about an alien which, in order to survive, like some spiders, it has to feed itself to its mate. And all this language, the language is told from the viewpoint of this alien creature. I'll give it really quick. Do you hear, my little red? Hold me softly, the cold grows. I remember. That was a flashback in the alien's head. I am hugely black and hopeful. I bounce on 6 legs along the mountains in the new warm. Sing the changer, sing the stranger. Will the changes change forever? All my hums have words now. Another change. You do get into the logic and the sort of storytelling of this creature, but it takes a little while. And again, like many Tiptree stories, it requires two readings. The other story is the one that really kind of knocked me out. I find kind of very upsetting and disturbing, kind of beautiful stories. On the Last Afternoon. She tells a 25-page story in which you have about 3 novels worth of ideas. It's about a bunch of people from Earth who crash on some planet, and they find a place to live, and they encounter an alien growth. It's like a bug or a plant, and one of the people from this flight has learned how to communicate with it. And in the course of the story, he says something like human beings are the people who love their children so much they want to preserve them and pass on their history to them, which becomes very ironic before the story's over. And what it turns out is that this land that they live in, this place they've been in for 30 years, is the breeding ground for some huge, monstrous, ugly, horrific creatures. It's really a weird story. I think of them as like, huge, giant elephant seals. They're ugly, and they're these creatures come onto the beaches every 30 years and they breed. And she describes this man is trying to save his camp from this breeding. And she goes on to describe them. The creatures actually start coming up to breed, and the violence and horrificness of mating for these creatures. Her feelings for sexuality are conflicted, to say the least. And it has one of the most. It goes on a little too long, actually, but it's an amazing story. Anyway, that's it. I don't want to say any more. James Tiptree Jr., Alice Sheldon, Raccoona Sheldon. The biography is great fun, great fascinating character, and these stories still hold up. The girl who was plugged in, many of the, I think William Gibson gave credit to that story, as well as other cyberpunk type writers, because it's about a woman who plugs herself into an ugly woman who plugs herself into a bank of computers and becomes a beautiful woman, or her avatar is a beautiful woman. Anyway, all the stories are interesting, and they're varying types of stories, but there's no one who writes like Tiptree. Okay, and I've enjoyed this book quite a bit. Stay safe. Bathe with a vengeance. Bye.